welcome, dear friends and comments. This is a very special edition of the anti-war interviews of Without Censorship independent internet channel. Please remember that you can follow us not only in English but also in Polish, wbrew cenzurze, and in Russian. Our today's very special guest is Professor Glenn Diesen, specialist of political science, international relations and security issues, lecturer of the University of South Eastern Norway, author of the much renowned books about Russia's geoeconomic strategy for Greater Asia, EU and NATO relations with Russia, Russian conservatism and Russophobia, propaganda in international politics. Welcome, dear Professor Diesen. Professor Diesen, let me start from the very up-to-date issue and question. Do you think that can we observe decline of the Russian-Ukrainian war? Is it already a retreat of the Ukrainian as well as the Western forces involved in this conflict? Not only because this infamous counter-offensive just stuck, but also because there are so many conflicts within the Ukrainian government and between Western supporters of the Kiev regime. Do you think we are near the end?
I think it's reaching that point. I think a lot of the analysis of the war has been incorrect because people have been assessing the war based on how much territory is taken. But keep in mind that this has become a war of attrition where both sides are trying to exhaust the other, NATO with Ukraine on one side and the Russians on the other. So I think it's wrong to see it only in terms of territory, because if the goal is to exhaust the adversary's military forces and preserve your own, then you have an interest in not doing too great offensives if it's going to lose a lot of men. And if you're in a bad position to defend, you're better to withdraw if necessary. So I think that often in the West, we obsessed a bit about territory, which is why the Americans, for example, pressured the Ukrainians to launch this counteroffensive, which was very destructive. Again, they lost so many men and only took a little bit of territory. Now, the problem in a war of attrition is once the adversary is exhausted, whoever is on the winning side take the territory thereafter, after the opponent has been weakened. So I think that after this huge, if you see what happened over the past year, NATO armed Ukraine, they mobilized a lot of people, they had this counteroffensive, which was disastrous, they lost so many men, so much equipment, and now the consequences for the Ukrainians, few men, few equipment. Even NATO is now admitting there's not much ammunition left to send, which is why we've been sending, depleted uranium and cluster ammunition. As Biden himself said, we don't have anything else at the moment to send. So this is a key problem. Meanwhile, so the Ukrainians and NATO has exhausted themselves. And on the other side, you have the Russians. And over the past year, they mobilized hundreds of thousands of men. They acquired a huge amount, built a lot of equipment. Again, they're producing more military hardware now than NATO. And they also were able to source weaponry from abroad. So they've been building up a huge military force in the rear. So I think the point where we are now is that Russia is in the position to effectively defeat Ukraine. And we already see this. They have much more artillery. This is where the casualties occur. They have better electronic warfare, more missiles, more drones, more manpower. They control the air with dominance of aircrafts, helicopters. So across the board, the attrition rate, that is the kill ratio on each side, is very favorable to Russia. So I think now it's just a matter of time. And of course, given that we have this huge concern around the West, where we kind of lost a bit interest in the war or given up, I think that war fatigue is probably the better word for this. I think it's I think we're entering the final chapter in which you see that the front line, the Ukrainians are exhausted. The defenses are being fractured and weakened and exhausted. So I think at some point things will start to fall apart a bit, but it's not a thing that happens overnight. I think that this can go on for months still. But I don't think this can be turned around. Russia will eventually win this. So in my opinion, which I've been saying for the past 2 years, we should negotiate, sit down, negotiate, find the best possible a deal for the Ukrainians, because yeah, again, and of course the Russians suffer too, but the Ukrainians have really suffered in this war. So we should, if there's no victory, we should definitely sit down and discuss and negotiate.
Yeah, I think the problem with the negotiation is that it's still hardly acceptable, especially in the West, that the deal, for example, land for peace, is absolutely necessary in some stage of the war, in any kind of the war. But in fact, we are now in two very sensitive moments, because from the internal Ukrainian political situation, we have increasing conflict between President Zelensky, General Zaluzhny, and now his own participation in this conflict announced Major Vitaly Klitschko. Who himself was for the long considered to be representative of some kind of German interest in Ukraine rather than the Anglo-Saxon ones. And in the same moment, we have well, kind of crisis with financing further war. We know the decision of the U.S. Senate about the suspension for now of the financial help, this deal of President Biden, including more than $60 billion for the Ukraine. In the same time, European Commission confirmed that about 50 billion of euros would be still available for the Kiev regime. So, do you believe that some kind of some interest in the Ukrainian war is shifted from the Washington to Europe? Do you believe that, for example, on some stage when American interests would be more focused on the Middle East or on the Far East, could Europe, for example, German or European Union, be more interested in holding this war to continue?
Well, I think you touched on three issues first. Well, there was a question about the split in Ukraine, and then the shifting responsibility from the US to EU. But first, you mentioned that the territorial issue, the land for peace, and I would just like to add very quickly that wasn't necessary in the beginning, because keep in mind that since the Minsk agreement, the agreement was that Donbass should be reintegrated into Ukraine. The main issue was language and cultural rights for the Eastern Ukrainians through autonomy, but that autonomy would also be able to keep Ukraine out of NATO. That was also the deal the Ukrainians and Russians almost had after the Russians invaded, which was, the only thing the Russians wouldn't compromise on was neutrality. Everything else was on the table. This has been confirmed everywhere. So it didn't start off by having to trade that much territory for peace. But for the Russians now, they see taking territory is a way of ensuring that NATO doesn't get a strong foothold in Ukraine. So this is my main concern when the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is saying, listen, after this war is over, we're going to get Ukraine into NATO. Well, imagine if you're sitting in the Kremlin. What are you thinking? If this is an existential threat, they don't want to negotiate. They reject the neutrality, and they will take Ukraine into NATO after the war. What will you do? Well, you will strip it of all strategic territory. So from Kharkov to Odessa, so where you find the main economy, the coastline, natural resources. This is also the more Russian-friendly or Russian-speaking people. So this is very unfortunate. So it didn't have to be this way, but at the end, yes, it's going to end up this way. It has to be some territory now, and this is again, it's unfortunate, and for people who find it to be unjust, I can of course understand it. But of course, the reality is there as well. And yeah, regarding the split, I agree as well. I think this was very predictable, because in Ukraine you have very different forces going on. You have, the political leadership with Zelensky. As you mentioned, he's got a bit of a tension and conflict now with Zaluzhny, which is military leadership. And then, of course, you have the nationalists as well. You have regional leaders like Klitschko, and of course, you have got civil society. So there's a lot of, I think these are very different groupings. I think what they had in common was, you had an invading foreign army coming in. They thought we'll all stand together and fight the Russians. But now this is out the window. Once you're losing, Now it's a different question. Now, who is to blame and who should be allowed to negotiate what comes next? Suddenly, all those forces, very different, who had were on, in the same camp, will split more and more. So these divisions, once Ukraine became evident it would lose, I think it was quite obvious that a lot of these people would start to turn on each other. And in terms of the U.S. losing interest, or it's sent what it wanted to send, and of course Israel has to be prioritized above Ukraine for the Americans. That makes sense for them. I don't think it's possible for the Europeans to take over that. I mean, the Americans are really the heavy hitters on this, and indeed I don't think the Europeans would have had, I guess, the audacity to go this far in a conflict with Russia if the Americans hadn't been standing behind them. I think if the American support dwindles away, I think the Europeans will be much more careful. Same in this country, in Norway. The way we speak to Russia now, if it was us, country 5 million, talking to a neighboring country like Russia in this way, we would never do this unless the Americans were standing behind us. So I think with the American support falling away, the Europeans will be humbled to some extent. But also it's the capabilities. I mean, the United States is a huge military power. The Europeans, not so much. And even within the EU now, you see, from Hungary, Slovakia, there's a lot of countries now quickly losing interest or becoming more cautious about this war probably spreading. And so I think a lot of questions might start to come up now in Europe. So, for example, we talked about defeating Russia. What exactly does this look like? How to defeat the world's largest nuclear power? Do we think NATO is going to be able to march into Crimea without sparking a nuclear war? Like, I think a lot of these questions, there might be more willingness to ask them now that there's more uncertainty.
I think that, yeah, a lot of analytics, even those supporting Kiev regime till now, thinks about the perspective of change in the American policy and relate them to the change in the White House. Do you think that this probable or predicted shift from the Democrats to Republicans, including possible re-election of President Trump, could be a real change, a real game changer for the global geopolitics, or that would be just the shift between the another fields of war? So instead of the war in Ukraine, we will have the war in the Southeast Asia. Do you think that we are have no other choice than this kind of spread, divided proxy global war?
Unfortunately, I think it's there's not really a peace party. You have both parties being quite militaristic. I think it's part of also, from how the political system's built up, the role the United States sees itself, that they're supposed to be, the one indispensable power holding the whole world together, that they see this as a responsibility. But no, I see neither of them suggesting that it would be a good idea for the US to pull a bit back, reduce the empire, regain some of its strength, fix its society, its economic issues, its fiscal. Like, no one's talking really about this, except maybe some on the libertarian wing, maybe RFK as well. But between the Republicans and the Democrats, I think it's mostly an issue of which war do we prioritize, because the Democrats seems to be very, gung-ho on going after Russia ever since Russiagate, and the Republicans, they seem more to prioritize going after China. So I don't expect any peaceful peace to set in. I think the wider conflict, which will unite, which will, lead the United States forward no matter what, is the wider conflict we have in the world, which is that after the Cold War, they wanted to build an international or world order based on unipolarity. That is one center of power, the United States, organizing the world around liberal ideals. Now, this world is now gone. Like, the world now is multipolar. It's hard to ignore otherwise. If you look at China, there's technologies, there's economy. Also, Russia, we have to recognize, is also a superpower now. We threw everything we had at them, and they're still winning. So this is pretty much the definition of a great power, one that's able to resist all the pressures from the leading power in this international system. So this is where we are at the moment. We're kind of between unipolarity, with one center of power, and multipolarity, and it's being pulled in different direction, and this is what's creating a lot of chaos. Because containing either, Russia or China, and kind of denying them to be independent poles of power in this system, it's going to, unleash a lot of more conflicts. So I think, yeah, either way who wins, I think it's going to be more conflicts. Even though maybe I'm pessimistic, because I also seen something interesting happening in the Republican Party. You've probably seen the same, from the Tucker Carlsons to the Donald Trumps and the Vivek. I forgot his last name, Ramashami, or yeah, sorry. But they're all speaking a very different language now. They're talking, more about the United States having a more modest role in the international system, and perhaps this would be in the best interest of the United States. So I'm a bit pessimistic, but I think at the moment, if anyone would try to scale back the empire, I think it could actually be the Republicans.
Yeah, I like this answer. Heard sometime that on the question why do you so pessimistic, the answer was because I like to be right. So yeah, I think
That's a
that's
good
the
answer.
point. Yeah, I think that.
Well, so just gonna have one thing. If you see whoever wins, I mean, after Bush, you had after Clinton, he had all these wars. You had Bush, he won the election. How did Bush win the election? Well, he was saying we're not going to have any nation building. What did he have? The biggest nation building they ever had. And then Obama comes. We're going to have a change. We're going to have a different one. And what does he do? He intensifies, everything from the droning, expands the U.S. empire. So after another, they kind of they win on a peace platform, which is, I think, a lot of Americans would like to go down this path, but then they take them somewhere else. So actually, Trump was the only one who didn't start any new wars, which is quite interesting. And sorry for interrupting you, by the way.
No. I agree, and I think that they are one of the greatest disappointments of the American, but not only American leftists. That was Obama policy about the international order. That he was still trying to reach some kind of world order. In general, in line with the Bush's policy, and yeah, well, I think that it was very close to be also disappointing for the rights. For the rightist people in the world, when we observe, for example, Donald Trump policy against Iran, earlier about the North Korea, it was very close to the war, but it was still avoided. So that was very interesting moment in American policy, because it was really. I can't remember any other moment when we was so close and ended without another bombing, except from the few ones. Yeah, I think
that's the only time he got favorable mentioning in the media, was when he decided to bomb Syria. But that's the only time he got any praise from the media. But again, that was an existing war before he came, so we can still attribute him for not starting new wars, at least, even though he assassinated an Iranian general, and it's not a peacemaker, but still, compared to the predecessors, I think it was a positive direction.
Yeah, well, I think that again, speaking about the leftists, I think that the moment for today is, for example, attitude of Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, who are, of course, not as much as pro-Israeli supporters as the other mainstream politicians, but they still in line with the mainstream. And I would like to ask you, I think that we return to the questions of the multipolarity, which are absolutely basic for the international affairs now. But first, about the Peace Party, because living in Scotland, which is unfortunately still part of the United Kingdom, we hear very often this sentence that there is no peace party in the UK as well, and it's really hard to find any kind of peace party in the mainstream politics of the Western European states. In Britain, we can observe that on the example of the Labour Party, which is strongly on the warmonger side, and as far as Ukrainian issue, as far as the Israeli issue concerned, we have very interesting shift in the policy of the Green parties, which are now among the first line for warmongers, supporting NATO, supporting even the arm race and nuclear powers, which was absolutely unbelievable for the Greens in the 80s. Yeah, and the spirit of the Rainbow Warriors has been forgotten. It's absolutely true for any left movements in the West. And I would like to ask you, what do you think about of course, the Palestinian crisis, this bombing of Gaza, this ethnic cleansing perpetuated by the Zionist government, of course, caused many protests in the West. There are millions of marching people in London, in other Western capitals. But in the same time, anti-war movement related to the Ukrainian question was much weaker. A couple of years ago, we observed massive people protest against the involvement of Britain or other countries in the Iraqi conflict. Now, people are much more passive against the war. We cannot see this movement again on the streets. Of course, we can blame the censorship in the mainstream media as well. But do you believe that is any possibility for mobilization of anti-war consciousness from the West?
Specifically on Ukraine, you mean?
Especially that.
Yeah, I guess I think that the problem is the lack of familiarity, because with the war in Israel, I think people they're familiar with it from before, and also it doesn't have good optics because you have this powerful Israeli army supported by the United States just hammering on against a civilian population, and it's very difficult to despite the best effort of the United States, to paint this as simply, oh, they're just fighting terrorists, when obviously you have these wider problems, like, well, what are you going to do with the whole Palestinian population? They're not going to have a state. They're not going to have rights because, you want to have a Jewish state only. How are you going to solve this? So I think people see that this is ethnic cleansing and, massacres. So I think it's because of familiarity and the obvious war crimes being committed. I think it's easier for peace movement to come. I think in the Ukraine conflict, it's I guess the unfamiliarity with it makes people more vulnerable to a lot of political propaganda. Because see what happened when the Russian army invaded in February of 2022. Suddenly, the same day, all the entire public of the West started to go out and saying how awful this is, and they knew exactly what had caused this war. They knew exactly what Russia's motivation was. No one could have found Ukraine on a map. Well, Poland could, but in especially in the United States, so it was, people knew very little, if anything, about this conflict over the years. And yet, so how did they know this? How did they know what position to take? And I think when you don't know many of the facts, this is when propaganda plays in, because propaganda is often, it's a way of convincing an audience without appealing to reason. So, for example, you just explained this is a conflict, good versus evil, and all information coming in is fed through this. So we just said, oh, they're just a poor, aspiring democracy trying to get out of Russia's shadow, and they just want their freedom, and Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union. Now, if you buy into that narrative, any peace is horrible, because now I can understand that if you think that the Russians just wanted new territories, they want to restore the Soviet Union. If this is the case, I would say, well, we have to send weapons then, because we have to increase the cost. I would also agree, then we have to, say no to negotiations, because then we'll reward this expansionism. So suddenly all of this makes perfect sense. However, if the public had a bit more information and they knew effectively what a lot of the American leaders from the 1990s and until now, I mean, ambassadors, foreign ministers, CI directors, they all confirmed through all these years that Russia considers this to be an existential threat to have NATO in Ukraine. That doesn't mean that the invasion is legitimate or it should be supported. That's not my point. But if we recognize that Russia sees this as an existential threat, then there's no way this can be won against the Russians without this being escalated, until a nuclear war. it would be as if Russia or China started to build military lines and military bases in Mexico. It's just it would be a horrible, it would definitely end in war. Doesn't mean I would support Americans bombing Mexico to the ground, but this would be the predictable result. So I think it's the lack of familiarity. So people are afraid that if they suggest peace, that means they're rewarding Russian imperialists. So it's very hard, and I see it in this country as well. I mean, anyone who tries to explain the Russian motivations, they are immediately labeled as Putinists and how much do you get paid from the Kremlin, this kind of nonsense, and they try to have you fired from your jobs at universities, and it's quite toxic. So it's very hard to get a peace movement in that scenario. So
I think this experience is very common from Poland and Norway as both NATO border countries, and I believe that intensification of the Russophobia and this kind of propaganda and also censorship is quite similar here. And yeah, that's the point, because you have written very significant book about the Russophobia as an important example of the information war and the position of information war within the international relations. We still wait, I think, for another book of you about the think tank racket element. Yeah. So yeah, that's the point. What's the position in this present war and in the probably the future one? How important is this propaganda factor for these conflicts?
Well, I think the propaganda is quite severe. I mean, the propaganda can have benefits and disadvantages. I mean, and this isn't my point. I took it from Walter Lippmann, because he was a century ago, he was effectively one of the main ones coming up with the key literature for propaganda, also working for the U.S. government. So Walter Lippmann, he made the point that the benefit of propaganda is effectively when you present everything as a struggle of good versus evil, which is what we do. We always, against Russia through history, it's always been, the civilized versus the barbarian, the Europeans versus the Asians, and then now we have, the liberal democracies versus the authoritarian, and everything is, it translates into good versus evil. He said that the benefit of this would be that, you help to mobilize the public, because if, it's like against Germany in World War I, if this is a war against pure evil, now you can mobilize the public. It's everyone wants to fight evil. It's necessary. However, once there's a possible peace in place, once you can make peace, an agreement, mutually beneficial, it's very difficult to make it, because how are you going to tell your public that you're going to make peace with evil? Now, you're appeasing evil, and this is, well, would we make a deal with Hitler? This is what we always hear about Russia, that, oh, this is just like, the 1930s with Hitler. It's appeasement. We can't negotiate. So this is the problem of propaganda, by pretending as if this isn't an issue of conflicting security interests, something that could be resolved with mutual understanding and compromise. Instead, we end up with this very vicious propaganda, which ends up hurting actually both sides. So I think that this is a huge part of it, because with all of these pressures, we see that rationality has to take a back seat, because we use these very powerful stereotypes. We demand group loyalty, and everything is an issue of us versus them. And in Norway, for example, you see debates or participate in debate. They don't care what you're saying. If it's objective facts you're coming with, it doesn't matter. All they want to hear is, wait, is this giving legitimacy to our side or their side? They just want to know, make sure that you're sitting in our trenches, not theirs. And if you're our trenches, you have to play ball. You have to repeat the same catchphrases, the same slogans. And it's very counterproductive, and at the end of the day, you end up undermining your own security.
Do you think that well, I'm a journalist, so for me, it's also crisis on any kind of reliability of media, of course, but it's not a new experience for the independent journalists, of course. And this element of censorship we know from the pandemic period, and of course even before when we know about the Julian Assange story and the other problems. But do you think that we have now also crisis within the academical dispute about this within the scholarship of international relations, because we can discuss about the crisis of some kind of realistic approach to the international relations. Kissinger has passed as renowned author as John Mearsheimer has to confess that it's an element of the propaganda factor is now overwhelming the realistic approach to the international affairs. But do you think that how scholarship, how academical environment could still consist independent, still present independent analysis of this situation within following the propaganda line? We have censorship on the universities, we have censorship in media. It's still possible to have this zone of just academical dispute about the international affairs, even with such a crisis, like Ukrainian or Palestinian one?
Well, I think ideally, because what you have in university, in academia, but also in journalism is quite unique, because this is really should be the key pillar of where you find freedom of speech and academic freedoms. So I think if it's lost in those areas, I think that's all hope would be out pretty much, because in other areas of society you don't enjoy this kind of freedom of speech. But I think it's still the diminishing. And you mentioned John Mearsheimer, which is a great example, because I would argue possibly be the most famous academic in international relations living today. And he had students in University of Chicago who came out after Russia invaded and demanded that he would have to change his views and his conclusions if he's going to be allowed to work there. I mean, just think about it for 1 second. Like, now you're saying, your conclusion has to be this. This is your end point of your analysis. Whatever way you reach it, this is how you have to end. But this is by definition propaganda. This is by definition bias. That is, if you can only allow to reach one conclusion, and so change it. But this is this is in academia the opposite of what I tell my students. I say you can argue your conclusion or your argument can be whatever you want, but it's the way you argue. Are you able to present evidence? Are you able to counter the counter arguments? It doesn't make any sense. But now we're effectively saying no, you can't argue what you want anymore. This is only one conclusion, and yeah, so it's very difficult. And I think I experience it again in Norway as well. I have, you have this. Some of them call themselves journalists, but others call themselves, human rights activists, and they're never interested in actual discussion. They just want a label. They say, "Oh, he's a propagandist," and then they try to spread it in the newspapers. They go right on your Wikipedia page, and then call, whoever speaks to you, they will try to shame the network, because, hey, how dare you speak to him? Do you know who he is? He's a propagandist. The only questions I ever received from the Norwegian media would be, have you traveled to Russia lately? Why have you talked? Why have you spoken with the Russian journalists? Why have you published in Russian media? Will you condemn it? If you condemn it, why would you ever travel there? I mean, it's just it's childish, and it's absurd. So I even stay away from Norwegian media now. I don't want to talk to them, because nothing good can come from it, and I have to live in this country. So it's quite extreme. And I think a key aspect of because you say academia, that should be the beautiful part of academia is you build up credentials over time, and if your work that isn't properly proven, people can undermine you based on your merit. But the academic institution on its own, it just should be able to stand on, have that credibility. But a key issue of propaganda would be the recognition of source credibility. That is, People often say, oh, the Russian propaganda or Soviet propaganda was quite strong in the Cold War. But actually it wasn't, because when you have the Soviet propaganda was awkward. If you have a guy standing there in a military uniform, or, if you have a state channel who's, arguing something, you know who the source is, you know their biases, and this has a lot to say in communication theory. This is already proven. If you can hide the source, if you can build a credible source, that's something very different. So for that reason, the Western propaganda was actually better in the Cold War, because the Americans and British were often able to filter it through private industries. And of course, in 1980s, Reagan built this whole NGO empire, and the whole objective behind it was why should the CIA go around doing this information wars? We can just set up NGOs. They're funded by the government, they're staffed by the government, but we'll call them NGOs. And we have a lot of this today. We have it in Norway as well. They're state funded. They call themselves human rights organizations, but they only seem to, all their human rights they care about seem to align with power interests. So, they're very, very worried about Navalny, but they couldn't care less about Julian Assange. So the common denominator is not human rights; it's always geopolitics, but it's camouflaged in human rights. So my whole point is that they're coming in as another actor to rival academics. So they're saying, listen, we're coming here from virtue. We want to help human rights and democracy. This academic here, he's corrupt. He meets with Russians, and suddenly, you should be canceled. So I think that there's a lot of nefarious forces undermining academia these days. So sorry, that was a bit of a too long answer, perhaps.
No. I totally agree. Especially, I observed that lately during the debates in Ireland about the neutrality issue, and well, some independent groups just pointed that these NGOs, which were invited by the Irish government to take a part in this official debate and meetings, were widely funded by NATO institutions or arms industry, that was not independent sources of academical knowledge and expertise, but in fact that was the site of the debate about the neutrality. Decisively interested in another market for the arms industry and for the war industry as well. But speaking about what this mainstream propaganda cares about, I remember the typical example was just after a lot of these laments after Navalny. We had an example of my personal friend, Daria Dugina, murdered by the Ukrainian Secret Service with probable acceptance or help from the Anglo-Saxon intelligence, and it was nothing but delight from this tragedy, from this crime. Returning to the question of international relations and multipolarity, and speaking about mentioned Daria Dugina, I also would like to mention, of course, her father, because I remember that when I spoken with Professor Dugin for the very long before the war, he was repeating that we are in transition to multipolarity. And we know that we are going, but it's hard now to describe what stage, one moment we achieve when we reach to the some etaps, some moments, some steps of this transition. Do you think that we are already past the moment of undebatable unipolarity? So are we living now in the multipolar world, or is it just the moment of the future?
That's a good question, because how would you measure multipolarity? Often in international relations, it's common to often look at the military power, if they can balance each other, which is fair enough. But also, I think political economy is quite important, because the economics determines a lot whether it's multipolarity. And I think the unipolarity, if you look at where economic power has been in the past, I like to you often look at the American system as a nice way of addressing the economic architecture, because in the American system from the early 19th century, they had, three pillars. You had the strategic industries, control of transportation corridors, and then you have financial instruments. So I usually look at those pillars to see if there's multipolarity in the economic sense, because a hegemon, be it Britain or the United States, they would have the dominant industries, the high-tech industries of their time. They would control all the main transportation corridors, which is, as a sea power, which would be the main maritime corridors. They would have the dominant banks, the leading currency. So when I look at multipolarity, I think, well, look how the Chinese were able to break unipolarity. They were able to outcompete a lot of the Americans' technologies. They're now, a huge technological power. They developed a Belt and Road Initiative to have their own, corridors, both by land and sea, which are not controlled by the United States. They set up their own independent banks. They have their own trying to internationalize their currency, or using, doing this currency swaps, different arrangements. They set up their own payment system. So I think across the board, you see these three pillars being addressed. The Russians are doing the same. They make sure that all their digital giants in Russia, all of them are majority owned by Russia. They're building this polar Silk Road, or the Northern Sea Route, this Arctic route. They also connecting themselves to the North-South corridor with Iran and India, also East-West, so making themselves less dependent on Western corridors. They're setting up their own insurance systems. They're dropping the dollar and the euro. They're setting up their own banks. They're getting they had to get out of SWIFT. So again, I see that the economic hegemon is gone, and the more quickly it goes away, the more aggressively I think the United States will use it as a weapon against rivals, because it sees its power slipping. And the more the United States uses economic powers coercively, the more the rest of the world sees it as necessary to diversify as well. So I guess this huge diversification, in my opinion, the economics of it shows that you can't that unipolarity is gone. And that's what's interesting with this Ukrainian war, because we were going to defeat the Russians on the battlefield. We couldn't. That's a good indication unipolarity is over. We're going to crush the Russian economy before the weekend. We're going to destroy their currency. It's not happening. The Russian economy is growing. Germany is not doing well at all. Their currency is stable. So you're having, their technologies, they decoupled from the West. They're able to develop their own, or in partnership with non-Western states. So all of this is an indication that multipolarity is already here. The problem is that we're still pulling in different direction. Because if you're the United States, you want unipolarity. What does unipolarity mean? It's a system of sovereign inequality, which means, the hegemon has sovereignty, but the rest do not. So the US will claim, well, not just the US, but the collective West will say, we have the right to intervene in other countries. We can promote democracy, defend human rights. We can have, use military force. We can even take territory like we did with Kosovo. Everything's on the table. Sovereignty outside the civilized world would be conditioned. So this is a unipolar mentality. On the other hand, in multipolar system, which is now being championed by most countries outside of NATO, you see, for many centers of power, international law can't be based on sovereign inequality, it demands sovereign equality. So suddenly here they're saying, no, you can't interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries, for example. So they're even promoting different rules. But I wouldn't say that a multipolar system has manifested itself yet. Yes, militarily, economically, I would say we're almost there. But the rules, we don't have the same rules anymore, because the West still demands, no, this is sovereign inequality. We don't think twice about the legitimacy of us invading, for example, other countries or interfering in their domestic affairs. But we would never accept, for example, the Russians doing it in Western countries. So I think, I think that's where we are at the moment. It hasn't been accepted yet, at least. I think the realities on the ground in terms of weapons and economics are here. But the acceptance in terms of common rules and understanding of how states should behave, it has still not, we still haven't come to an agreement yet.
I think that almost there at the description of the present stage of the global order is I think the best one we can have for now.
Yeah.
And of course, I definitely agree, and I believe that the people from the border countries, especially like others, like Norway and Poland, could agree that even or especially declining hegemony is still very serious threat to the global peace and to the any kind of stabilization in the world. So of course we cannot still feel safe. But despite of being pessimistic about the future wars and conflicts, we can still think. I think this is the element of the optimistic point of view. We can think about the future possibly without the hegemon, so possibly with increasing sovereignty for the nations and the national states as well. Thank you very much, Professor Diesen. It was absolutely great pleasure for me to host you here in the interview with the Without Censorship channel. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you again for the invitation. It was very pleasant.
And I hope that it won't be the last our conversation. I hope we return to these discussions about international affairs in the future, and I hope that Polish readers and viewers will have many occasions to get more knowledge about your absolutely fantastic and very interesting work about international affairs and international security. And all our viewers, like always, I ask for the likes, for following us, for subscription of our YouTube channel, for following us on the Telegram, X, or former Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. Please remember that any comments should be longer than 9 words. That's always better on the YouTube. And of course, we will meet again very soon, speaking about the security, speaking about the peace, speaking about international affairs, everything which is it should be very close to us, because that's the future of our planet. That's the future of our families. Thank you once again, and see you soon. Thank you.
See you. Thanks.